So Vegas is going to be the big thing. Vegas is going to be all the rage. Um, the Golden Knights will be in the league in, I want to say in June, but technically once they make that $500 million payment, they are a member of the NHL and they are the 31st franchise. So I thought, you know what? Let's look back on the last expansion draft. Okay, let's look at what teams were able to do here. Now, the rules at the time were 26 of the 28 existing teams in the league at the time of the draft were allowed to protect either one goaltender, 5 defensemen, and 9 forwards, or 2 goaltenders, 3 defensemen, and 7 forwards. The Atlanta Thrashers and Nashville Predators had their entire rosters protected as they were the 2 newest franchises in the league, only being in existence for 1 and 2 years respectively. For teams protecting only one goaltender, there was no experience requirement for those left unprotected. For teams protecting 2 goaltenders, each goaltender left unprotected must have appeared in either 10 NHL games in the 99-2000 season or 25 games in the 98-99 season and 1999-2000 seasons combined. A goaltender had to be in net for at least 31 minutes in each game for the game to be counted against those totals. At least one defenseman left unprotected by each team had to have appeared in 40 games in 99-2000 or 70 games in 98-99 and 99-2000 seasons combined. At least 2 forwards left unprotected by each team had to have met the same requirements. 52 players were chosen in the draft. Each previously existing team lost 2 players, and both expansion teams filled a roster of 26 players. Only one goaltender or one defenseman could be selected from each franchise, but both the Blue Jackets and the Wild were to use their first 24 selections on 3 goaltenders, 8 defensemen, and 13 forwards. The final 2 picks for each team could be any position. So there we go. And it is an odd bunch here. So the first 6 draft picks, goaltenders. The Columbus Blue Jackets drafted Rick Tabaracci from Colorado. Jamie McLennan was drafted then by the Wild from the Blues. The Wild then drafted Mike Vernon from Florida. He didn't stay in Minnesota. Frederick Chabot was drafted from Montreal by Columbus. Dwayne Rollison was drafted from Buffalo by Columbus. Chris Terreri was drafted from New Jersey by Minnesota. He didn't play in Minnesota either. And yeah, so there you go. You got McLennan, Vernon, and Terreri against Tabaracci, Chabot, and Rollison. So it's a lot different than what Vegas is going to get in goal. Vegas is going to get a good one. Here's the thing, and I'm going to talk about this here. The conversation is this. So the Pittsburgh Penguins have a no movement clause on Fleury, so they have to protect him, exposing Matt Murray. So the fear is they have to trade Fleury before the deadline, except that they don't. They can say, okay, Matt Murray to us is worth 2 first-round draft picks. Go to Vegas and say, hey, do you want 2 first-rounders? And Vegas says, absolutely. And then instead of getting that goaltender, there's going to be plenty of good players from Pittsburgh for them to choose from. So while, yes, Matt Murray would be a fantastic addition to any team, Matt Murray is a Penguin. I think will be a Penguin. And if Marc-Andre Fleury is still a Penguin when the expansion draft rolls around, I really think Pittsburgh's going to have their butts covered. Now, the blue line. Here's where it gets weird. The blue line, Sean O'Donnell was drafted to the Wild from Los Angeles. Matthias Tamander, I should say, was drafted from Boston to Columbus. I didn't get upset when he got drafted. Burt Robertson was drafted from Edmonton by Columbus. I like Burt Robertson. Minnesota drafted Curtis Lecision from Carolina. Lecision was one of my favorite defensemen. Tommy Rahamaki was drafted from Toronto by Columbus. I don't think he ever played in the NHL. Ladislav Benesek was drafted from the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim by Minnesota. Chris Armstrong was drafted from San Jose by Minnesota. Jamie Pushor was drafted from Dallas by Columbus. I like Jamie Pushor because we share a birthday. I think he may have been born one day before me, but same year. Philip Kuba, drafted from Calgary by Minnesota, actually very key player for them. Lyle Odeline was drafted from Phoenix by Columbus, and they really tried to use him as like the face of the franchise that expansion year. Radim Bachanik was drafted by Columbus from Chicago. Oleg Orakovsky was drafted from Washington by Minnesota. Matthew Schneider was drafted from the Rangers by Columbus. Never played for Columbus. Ian Herbers was drafted from the Islanders to Minnesota. Artem Anisimov was drafted from Philly by the Minnesota Wild. And Ulis Junka was drafted from Pittsburgh by Columbus. So there's a tremendous lineup of, I don't even know if you could put together a really good defense core from that. I mean, and like you notice, you hear names and you go, wait a minute, that guy never played for the expansion. If you can remember this far back, you can be like, they didn't play for Columbus or Minnesota. No, because a lot of what a team will do when they draft an expansion is you don't just draft guys for your team, you draft guys you can trade. You draft, and in this case, they were drafting as well, knowing that these guys left as free agents, they get draft picks as compensation. That's really it's gold to a brand new team in the NHL. Now we get into the forwards, and this is where things are going to get kind of dicey. Jeff Sanderson was drafted by Columbus from Buffalo, and his career was resurrected in Columbus. Stacey Roost was drafted from Minnesota, or by Minnesota from Detroit. Interesting. Steve Yzerman was very upset that Stacey Roost was drafted away from Detroit and felt that it was a huge mistake and that Detroit would regret it. Roost never really became the player that I think a lot of us figured he was going to be, including Steve Yzerman. So the guy who now we all praise as being a great GM had a guy he played with who he saw something in that never really developed. Darryl LaPlante then was drafted by Minnesota from Detroit as well. So they grabbed both Detroit forwards when they had the chance. Turner Stevenson was drafted from the Montreal Canadiens by Columbus. Scott Pellerin was drafted from St. Louis by Minnesota. Robert Cron was drafted by Columbus from Carolina. Robert Cron, underrated forward, I always felt. Steve Hines. I like Steve Hines, drafted from Boston by Columbus. Hines, yeah, he should have been a Bruins whole career. Love the guy. Jim Dowd, drafted from Edmonton by Minnesota. Jim Dowd, who was traded to the Vancouver Canucks with František Kuchera for Jeff Brown in the Kirk McLean trade. Canuck fans know what I'm talking about. The trade that we all went, what? That's all they got for Jeff Brown? And then we heard the rumors and we went, oh, okay. All right. Yeah, that's fine. Tyler Wright was drafted from Pittsburgh by Columbus. Sergei Krivokrasov was drafted by Calgary from Minnesota. Jeff Nielsen was drafted from the Anaheim Ducks by Minnesota, and there was a lot of talk at the time that Nielsen was going to be a really good player, and just never really panned out. Kevin Adams was drafted from Toronto by Columbus. Jeff Odgers, tough guy, was drafted from Columbus by Minnesota. Dmitry Sobotin was drafted from the Rangers by Columbus. Steve McKenna was drafted from the Kings by Minnesota. Dallas Drake. He was one of those pests that I was talking about the other night. He was drafted from Phoenix by Columbus. Bruce Gardner was drafted from Tampa by Columbus. I believe Bruce Gardner is playing in Europe right now. Michael Brose was drafted from San Jose by Minnesota. Michael Brose, who up until last year on EA Sports NHL games, very highly rated player. Grab him out of the European League if you have NHL 16. I don't know if he's still in 17. I don't think he is. Joe Juneau, drafted out of Ottawa by Minnesota. Joe Juneau was done at this point. Done. Barry Moore was drafted out of Washington by Columbus. Darby Hendrickson was drafted out of Vancouver by Minnesota. And Darby Hendrickson was a key player for Minnesota that first year. Unexpectedly for Canuck fans, actually. Martin Streit was drafted out of Philadelphia by Columbus. Kevin Dineen was drafted out of Ottawa by Columbus. Yes, that Kevin Dineen, the one who's now known more as coach. Jeff Daw was drafted out of Chicago by Minnesota. Jeff Williams was drafted out of New Jersey by Columbus. Stefan Nilsson was drafted out of the Canucks by Minnesota. Thanks, because he never played. Zach Bierk was a goaltender, picked up from Tampa by Minnesota. And they did try to make it work with him. Zach Bierk was an interesting storyline there. Never quite made it. Sergei Lachenkin, drafted out of Dallas by Columbus. Cam Stewart, drafted out of Florida by Minnesota. And Ted Drury, drafted off the New York Islanders roster by Columbus. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and hit on Zach Bier. Born in Peterborough, Ontario, retired Canadian ice hockey player, played 47 games with the Tampa Bay Lightning, Minnesota Wild, and Phoenix Coyotes. His final NHL appearance came in November 9th, 2003, in a 2-1 overtime loss to the Mighty Ducks. Yeah, January 8th, 2003, Bier was part of hockey history while playing for the Phoenix Coyotes when he and Chicago Blackhawks goaltender Michael Leighton both earned their first NHL shutouts in a 0-0 tie. It was the first time in league history that two goalies had both earned their first shutouts in the same game. That had to be a barn burner. Yeah, they don't really get into the fact that he was part of that expansion team either. Wow. There we go. Zach Bier's career statistics at Hockey Database. The thing is, Hockey Database doesn't total up the wins or anything. Minnesota. Yeah, he only played one game for Minnesota. Played 60 minutes, 6 goals against on 27 shots, 778 save percentage. Really didn't quite work out for him. And yet down with Cleveland, which was their farm team, he had 24 wins, 18 losses, 5 ties, 2.89 goals against, and a 909 save percentage. I don't know why I'm getting into Zach Bier. I guess it's because these are the kinds of guys who Vegas is probably going to end up with. Vegas is going to get a better team than what I've described here for Columbus and Minnesota. But remember this, Columbus had a very competitive season. Minnesota had a hard-fought season too. Neither of them were the worst team in the league. Columbus looked very respectable, and we all felt that Columbus was probably going to be a pretty good team within a couple of years. The fact that it's taken this long for Columbus to look like a contender is surprising because they were put together very well in the beginning. Their jerseys weren't. Lord knows that weird green wasp thing was just weird. Blue Jackets has nothing to do with a wasp. So I don't know what that was about. At least Vegas, I'm not quite sure what Vegas is thinking either. But, at least it's not a wasp, I guess. So here's the thing. You go over that list and you think of the guys who get drafted and then get moved or become free agents. I think Vegas has a lot more moves they can make because they're the only one. There's no other team coming in. They're by themselves. And this may be the only expansion we see for the next little while. Like, I know Seattle is where the NHL wants to go. It's obvious. You had Seattle, you had Vegas, boom, you got 16 teams in both conferences. And all the talk of who else is going to move, that's a moot point right now because the Canadian dollar is in precarious placement and it could get a lot worse. I read a financial website that basically stated the Canadian dollar could drop into the 65 cents on the American dollar range. And that's getting into the territory the Canadian dollar was in when Calgary, Vancouver, Edmonton, and Ottawa were all being rumored to be on their way out of the NHL. And they were all going to get moved to the States because the Canadian dollar was just garbage. And it was costing so much for owners north of the border to ice a team. Because every time that Canadian dollar drops, it means that you going to see a game in Canada makes the team less money. So they have to up the ticket prices. Well, eventually up the ticket prices so much to try to make up for the difference in the dollar that fans don't want to go, especially if you're not icing one of the top teams in the league. So it starts to get worse, and then the NHL looks and goes, well, they're not making any money, and the Canadian dollar's in really bad shape, and now their attendance is dropping. I mean, in Arizona or Carolina, it's still an American dollar. So if you're going to move a team north, it has to be an Atlanta situation where it's just untenable, completely untenable. So you have to have, I would say, poor ownership or no ownership, poor attendance, and an iffy building. And I think if all three of those things are together, you might get your team moved to Canada. But even then, it's if. So I just figured it'd be fun to look back at what Columbus got and what Minnesota got. And they were the last teams to come in. as expansion fodder. And so what I want you guys to do is in the comment section below, one thing I've been thinking about today: who would be good candidates to play for the for the Golden Knights next year? I'm not talking about expansion draft. I'm talking about actual players for the Golden Knights next year. Who would be good to see maybe resurrect their careers, and who would make sense financially, and who would want to take on that task. So I think there's an interesting story to tell here. It's just a matter of whether or not it's going to be told. And I think it's really going to come down to George McPhee and his ability to wheel and deal. That's why I want to see this $500 million money or $500 million payment put in, so that McPhee can start doing some work. Because watching a team get built from the ground up, this is the fun stuff. And outside of potentially Seattle, we may never see it again. So it is a fun thing to see happen. And I've seen it happen a bunch of times, and it kind of sucks that I won't get to see it very often. Part of what I like about playing NHL games on the PlayStation, one of the few things EA Sports allows you to do kind of is create your own team. They allow that this year anyways. Create your own team. And for me, I usually use journeymen, players that are out of the league from European leagues. I'll grab those guys and just build a team from the ground up and watch it build. It's kind of fun. Yeah, but let me know what you guys think in the comments below. How much better is Vegas going to be than what Minnesota and Columbus were their first year? And can they become a contender quickly? That's really the question. Let me know your answer. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're just browsing through.